So, welcome to the HKS Energy Policy Seminar. I'm Joe Aldi, and I'll serve as the host today. Thank you all for joining us here in Rubenstein 414, and thanks to our friends, students, alumni joining us on Zoom in this hybrid format. We're thrilled to welcome our colleague from Harvard Business School, Professor Christian Kaps. Kaps is here for his talk, Are We There Yet? Evaluating the Transition to EVs. Professor Kaps is an assistant professor of business administration and the technology and operations management unit at Harvard Business School. His primary research interest is in the energy transition, with a particular focus on how the evolution of storage technologies shapes capacity and investment decisions in renewable power and fossil fuel plants. Additionally, he focuses on the role that customers' sustainable behavior plays in accelerating the adoption of new technologies and how local differences influence the setup of power markets around the world. Professor Kaps earned his PhD in operations management at the Wharton School of Business at the University of Pennsylvania. Kaps, welcome to the Energy Policy Seminar.
Thank you. Switch on the microphone. Okay, we're mic'd up. We're ready to go. Thank you for the introduction. And thanks for having me. This is a joint work together with Mike Toffel. And then I put some parentheses on here because there's sort of two parts of the project that I'll be talking about today. One really on the mobility and use of electric vehicles, and one on sort of managed charging. And we'll start with the mobility piece, and then we'll see how far we get in the EV charging world. And I don't think I need to pitch why you would study energy too long to this kind of audience, but I wanted to give you a little bit of an idea of how I sort of think about the question, how I'm coming at this problem. And so we as a sort of global society need to do something about carbon emissions. And what from a business perspective is super exciting about renewables is that over the past years, they have gotten cheaper in most markets than your fossil counterparts, cheaper in expectation. And we'll get to that expectation in sort of a little bit. And solar in particular is kind of at the forefront here, where if you look at the last 2 decades, solar has grown 1,000-fold. And just sort of to get a sense of the absolute magnitude, between 22 and 24, the world has added more solar than the US has power generation capacity total. And so we're kind of seeing this rapid growth of renewables, which is great. We're sort of hopefully getting cheaper electricity, and we're doing something about carbon. And if you kind of take a step back to where does this lead us from a carbon perspective, if I focus on electricity, you actually do want to realize that electricity as we're currently using it, no matter where it comes from, is only about 1/3 or so of global energy use. The rest is you burning fossil fuels directly. And so a lot of my work has actually been here on the sort of electricity piece, but I think a really big question as well of how do we actually electrify all of the fossil fuel use, because then we can do what I've spent, as Joe mentioned, a lot of my time so far on, like how can we decarbonize it? So a lot of my research in the past has been on using storage to do this. How are individuals, for example, willing to pay more for renewables or batteries themselves? And how is this fact that companies and so you and I can start investing in those technologies changing power markets? But today we'll have the great chance to talk a little bit about electrification, because as the name electric vehicle kind of suggests, we're doing vehicles, but in an electric way. And it actually connects, I think, that makes the electric vehicle really interesting to the sort of big question of how do I do decarbonizing correctly? And I'm going to show you the duck. I'm assuming, can I get a show of hands? Who is familiar with the duck curve? We got a pretty high hit rate, but we're not at 100%. So let me briefly walk you through what the duck curve means and why it's the sort of one of the obstacles currently to do this energy transition faster. So if you go to 2015, in energy transition terms, way back when, and you look at power prices, they look a little bit something like this. They fluctuate throughout the day, and then they peak in the evening when demand is highest. And the reason why it's called a duck curve, and the reason why this is a problem, is if you fast forward and you see this explosion in solar power, this is how prices in 2023 look like. And it's called a duck curve because it sort of looks like the duck is sitting on the prices, but there's a problem in sort of two ways. It's in the middle here of the day, solar is basically worthless, or there are negative prices, so you might not want to build more of it. And then here at the neck of the duck, when the sun sets and suddenly your energy demand spikes, you put your grid under tremendous strain, prices skyrocket. And I think the duck is sort of a symbol of you can't just keep doing things the way we have. You can't just keep adding solar and expect the energy transition to just work out. And so this is where I think electric vehicles come in as a really cool mechanism for two reasons. Electric vehicles are pretty large load. So if you compare, for example, American average home electricity use, it's about 10,000 kilowatt hours. Like the unit doesn't matter as much, but sort of the order of magnitude. And then the average home has 1.9 vehicles. So if you were to fully drive this electrically, that's sort of 2/3 of all the energy used in your home just with your electric vehicle use. And so if we're thinking about this first step of the energy transition, how do we electrify things? Like personal mobility is a huge chunk that you and I could sort of do. And then from an intermittency perspective, if we wanted to combat the duck curve, it's a trinormous opportunity because this vehicle looks pretty, it's nice, but in particular is a huge battery on wheels effectively. So it's not just I'm taking this huge load and I'm making it electric, but possibly if we manage it correctly, this might actually help us address with batteries some of the fluctuation in the power supply. And so it should be all good news. We have a technology that's kind of nice and electrified, and it allows us to manage electricity. Where's the problem? Well, if you look at adoption of electric vehicles or the use of electric vehicles, a lot of it is concentrated in sort of markets with really high regulatory or like a lot of regulatory emphasis, let's call it, on it, regulatory pressure. In other countries, notably the United States, the electric vehicle share, this is fraction of new vehicles, isn't quite as high. And if you take China out of this world average, sort of less than 10% of new vehicles might be electric. And if you look at all the vehicles on the road, it's single digits. And so you have this really cool technology, but how do we get more people to use it? And if you ask individuals, well, why aren't you getting EVs? They'll tell you many different things about charging and in particular kind of range and sort of like, I'm not sure if I can do all the things with my car. And this sort of comes from JD Power as a large survey of possible adopters. So on the adoption side, it's not quite as fast as we would want to outside of the regulatory environment that it's forcing it. And on the managed charging side, we're not the first to kind of realize like, hey, you could use electric vehicles as sort of batteries and help smooth the load on the grid. There's actually been some pilots over 10 years ago in Silicon Valley, for example, trying to figure this out. But then you fast forward another 10 years, and still Silicon Valley, still sort of pilot stage. And this idea of managed charging has never sort of like fully taken up. And in the US today, less than a quarter of all electric vehicles is being managed. If you take Tesla out of this, the ratio is even worse. And so a lot of the field here is kind of little pilots, survey data, and there's a lot happening, a lot changing, but there wasn't as much empirical research done in this space. I'm going to spare you with too much of the literature slides, but there's sort of one I wanted to share in different fields that are coming at the energy transition. If you're kind of looking, for example, at the question of what does range anxiety look like, or what can we say about how electric vehicles are being used? In the operations world, we do some modeling. There's been sort of 10 years ago, a lot of experiments and surveys being done in this space. And in the transportation science world, it's usually a bunch of simulations. But there's very few, although there's now a couple of more emerging papers, very few empirical papers that kind of look at this. What is the reality on the ground, and why are some of those things happening that we just talked about? And so what we want to do in this paper, we kind of want to empirically study both the usage of actual vehicles, like how are vehicles today actually used, rather than just asking people how would you hypothetically use them, what is currently already being done. And then both, if we look at the actual data, we look at actual empirical charging events, what's the possibility for managed charging, and can we maybe explain why less than a quarter of vehicles in the US are currently being managed for their charging. So far, so good? Yes? Yeah, great question. So managed charging, and I'll try to be more specific when we get to the get to that part. For me, it's everything you do with the charging that's not just plug in and charge as quickly as you can right away. And with sort of the benchmark is going to be this kind of unoptimized, you plug in, you take as much energy as you can until the car is fully charged. But there's different ways in which you can do it. There's also different ways in which you can get paid for it. And they have sort of different implications for what you want to set as a charging speed, but then also who's an interesting customer for, let's say, an OEM trying to set up charging. But I'll be more specific about what exactly we mean with managed charging. Yes. Cool. So two parts. The first one, mobility and usage, and I'm imagining us spending most of the time there. And then we have a sort of working paper we're trying to submit in the next week or so. So I would be excited to share maybe one or two results there if we get there. But if not, that's totally fine. Happy to chat about it offline too. Now, BEV and usage. We're going to work together with BMW. You can get from my accent that I'm German. I actually used to work at a company, but there's no relation to having acquired this data. But they're a German OEM manufacturer, but we look at their US vehicles. And so we're going to look at a data set of about 21,000 electric vehicles and 300,000 ICEs. And all the vehicles are sort of 2021 and later. And so you partially because that made them have the data and the hardware required to sort of track the telemetry that is being recorded. But also, if you're thinking about electric vehicles, we're looking at fairly modern vehicles, right? So the average range here of an electric vehicle in our data set is about 280 miles. And what we observe for those is what we're going to call sort of the unit of analysis is going to be a drive. We have 252 million of those. And a drive is a vehicle basically going from A to B. So I have a little like a schematic here. You start at a location, and what we see for this drive, we see the GPS coordinates of the starting point, the end point. We have a timestamp for each, and then we observe kind of the distance in between, average temperature, how many people were in the car. And because we have the vehicle ID and the user ID, we can kind of follow those cars around. Where are they driving throughout the year of 2023? Okay? Cool. And with this is actually the first result, and it's conditional means. And so what we're looking at is we're looking how are both the electric vehicles and the combustion engines being driven. I'm going to use BEV and ICE as sort of acronyms for both of it. And the upshot here is that either this is being driven the same, used the same, or if anything, the electric vehicles in our data are being used slightly more. And so where this is interesting, I think from a sort of literature and knowledge perspective, most of the work in the past has said like, hey, electric vehicles are kind of used as a second vehicle. They might not being used as much, driven a little bit less. And then there's been a fair bit of work kind of showing like, hey, actually over time, the electric vehicles are being driven more and more. I think now we've reached a point where at least if you subset it to BMW drivers, and I'll get to a second of why this might be important, there's the cumulative usage, total kilometers driven, is the same. And I think having, it's not so much about the fact that they're BMW drivers. I think what is helpful about having this kind of data is that they're the same OEM. Because if you look at some of the research that has been done in the past, the reason why, I think part of the reason why the electric vehicles are being driven less than the ICEs is you're kind of averaging across all consumers. And usually households with higher income drive less mileage, and usually households with higher income are also more likely to adopt electric vehicles. And so if you kind of just look at across the population who is adopting electric vehicles, they are the people who are driving a little bit less. And then you look at all the people together, they're going to drive more irrespective of whether they have an EV or an ICE. So being able to just control for owners from one OEM, I think gives us a kind of a clean measurement. Yes. Drives per. Yeah, sorry, that's a good question. So if there's some kind of measurement in if you go on like a let's say a longer trip and you drive from A to B and then you stand there for 5 minutes and then you continue driving, this would be sort of aggregated into a trip. So the drive is the sort of you go from A to B and then you do something else. If there's like a small enough pause in between, we can get sort of a trip measurement. It's mainly there to show that the drives, a sort of smaller unit, is very comparable, and it's mainly here to show that this difference isn't driven by, let's say, ICEs always go on those really long road trips and the EVs are only driven for short distances. Yeah, it's a little complicated, the exact definition. It's a combination of like, how long are you stopping relative to your driving time? What is the heading angle of your car in the entire trip? So like, I can point you to the appendix of the paper where you specified there. But yeah, the intuition is sort of a longer trip in one direction with not too long of a break in between. Yeah, cool. So upshot, EVs today if you take modern enough vehicles and you make them sort of comparable on the user base are being driven as much as non-EVs. And so I think for OEMs, this is really interesting to start thinking about how much do we need to keep investing, expanding the technology and the capability of our vehicles, or do we want to work on sort of other questions? And of course, from a policy perspective, what do we do with the technology that maybe in some areas has reached kind of usage parity, and how do we think about incentivizing maybe further adoption? And of course, what story and what kind of marketing do we do around this technology? Now, range anxiety or electric vehicle use, of course, isn't just an average data kind of phenomenon. What most people are kind of afraid of when you look at survey data is to really like, can I use it for all the trips I sort of have in mind? And so what we're doing is we're just taking the average value that I've just shown you, and we break it out by the distance of a trip that you're doing. And so the x-axis here, you can take your preferred metric, kilometers or miles, and we're binding like how many trips do you do of a certain length. And what you see here, the red bars are the electric vehicles, the blue bars are the ICEs. And so similarly for any kind of short trip, there's seemingly no difference. Actually, for those medium kind of trips, the BEVs are being driven more frequently. And then once you get to around here, sort of 150 kilometers, let's say a little less than 100 miles, you start seeing sort of this separation where from that point onwards, the ICEs are being driven more, are going on more drives. This is across an entire year than the battery electric vehicles. And so one of the things we want to do in this work is kind of, I mean, for one is showing that this difference exists, but in particular, where this threshold is. So like up until like 100 miles, you're pretty good, which if you look here at the y-axis, naturally speaking, there's a lot more shorter trips in the data than there is long trips. And so we wanted to quantify how big is actually this difference if you go on longer trips with your EV. Because depending on how big this difference is, you might think of a firm of different solutions of how do we address this. And so for the short side, where the EVs are being driven more or the same as ICEs, this is, by the way, 99% of trips, up until about 150 kilometers, the EVs are already doing pretty well. And then if you go beyond this towards the right-hand side, more than 150 kilometers, this difference is 9 versus 6 trips a year. And so the difference currently, at least in the United States, is 3 trips a year on average between EV and ICE usage. And so depending on how you think about this, some users might think, I want to be covered under all circumstances all the time, and I want my EV to be able to, or like my vehicle to do everything. This might be an impediment to adoption, but you could also think about, hey, 3 trips a year. We've done some work in the appendix as well, where we show like how it's distributed over time. Maybe that is something that you can accommodate with the range extenders, rental models, or other kind of opportunities. But so 150 kilometers and then 3 long trips a year, that is currently the delta, and presumably as technology improves, this delta is gonna shrink even further. Okay. Now, so far, you might have realized this is all sort of averages across the population of data sets that we've seen. I haven't shown you some of the results that we've done where we sort of control for a bunch of things, but I wanted to now walk you through one kind of analysis, including all the controlled setup that we're doing for it to be a little bit more robust on certain analyses. And in particular, we wanted to look at this gap on what we call the road trip gap, that ICEs are being taken more frequently on those long trips. What can charging infrastructure do here? Like, presumably, if there were charging installations everywhere, and you could just plug in your car no matter where you are, this gap should kind of shrink. And then, of course, there's been some work done in this audience and in the literature on reliability of charging mattering as well. So it's, do I have chargers, and conditional on me finding this charger, like, is it sort of working? And from a kind of infrastructure perspective, how big is the boost of the infrastructure and kind of closing this gap between ICEs and EVs? And so what we're doing, we're trying to find sort of the best possible match of an EV, of an ICE for an EV user. So imagine like you're this red dot here with your electric vehicle somewhere in Somerville. We're going to look in sort of a radius around your home to find the most similar ICE possible. So same kind of model, you have the same kind of mobility characteristics, you go on the same number of trips on the shorter distance. And the reason why we're doing is we're sort of, if you look kind of similar on the short data and you live in the same location, presumably you would have pretty similar kind of propensities to go on long trips. You could both go to Arcadia, you could both go to New York, and sort of similar opportunities of where to travel to. And so with that, we're trying to control a little bit for the endogeneity of like who would get an electric vehicle and really make comparable the kind of long trips that people can go to. And then we're adding PlugShare data to it. This is like a public data source where on the one hand, people could plan their trip. If you wanted to go on an EV trip, you could say like, hey, I'm going from Boston to New York City. Show me like where there is chargers along the way. Pleasantly many options in the Northeast. But in particular, what PlugShare does, it gives you ratings and an opportunity as well to sort of comment on the state of the charger. And so not only do you have a really comprehensive list of the charging installations, but you would see, for example, for this charger here in Alston, the rating isn't super high, 3.6 chargers. And then if you go into it, you could actually kind of read the comments of users, like both were they able to charge and then like what was their experience like. And we're leveraging some work here by Liu and Asensio, who have done work to take all of those texts and classify them as like, did the user complain about reliability or not? And if 100% of the comments don't mention reliability, we're going to give the charger a score of 1, like perfect reliability. And if every single comment is going to complain about reliability, then it's going to get a reliability score of 0. And so what this looks like is you get some kind of distribution then here of reliability scores, and we're going to cluster them in low, medium, and high. And so what we're then going to do, imagine you have a road trip planned, maybe not quite from Somerville because we're now moving to LA, but imagine you have a road trip planned and you want to go somewhere to like Long Beach, LA. We're going to look around this destination, sort of take a 5-kilometer radius. The idea is that could sort of be a radius that you're willing to like park your car in a slightly different area to possibly charge there. Take a 5-kilometer radius and look at how many charging stations are around this location. And then we're also, because we have the reliability of all those charges, we're going to average the reliability score for all those charges around it. And so we then know for like every destination that a vehicle drove to, what was the charging count and what was the charging reliability at that location. Okay? And by the way, I know that the norm in this seminar is to hold questions until the end. I'm very happy to be interrupted during. I'm happy to answer questions at the end as well, but yes. Yeah, I think it's because if you have exactly 2 comments in the data, and one of them is a reliability concern and one of them doesn't, and you just sort of like mathematically you end up at like a 50% score. I think that's why you see some of those spikes as well, because it's discrete data and you're calculating fractions. Some of them might be a little higher. Yes. And sorry, yeah, the question was like, why is the peak at 0.5 so high? Ha! I'm remembering to repeat the question sometimes. Okay, so every location you go to, we have comparable EV, we have comparable ICE, and for every destination you go to on a long trip, we kind of know how much charging is there and how reliable is it. Now, little numerical example, some of my co-authors like sort of walking once through the math before diving into all of the details. So imagine like an ICE goes on 1.8 of those long trips. So a long trip now is like longer than 150 kilometers. And the BEV that we've matched together goes on 1.4. Then we would count this road trip gap as 29%. So the ICE goes on 29% more of those longer trips. Okay? If you go to destinations where there's very limited charging, so like 0 charging, which would be no availability whatsoever, or exactly 1 station, this road trip gap is somewhere between like 56 to 74%. And in particular, the reliability here isn't sort of like perfectly strictly increasing. But mainly, let's start as a baseline, 56, 74, 59%. What happens if you add more charging stations to this picture? So if you go to an area with like 2 to 9 stations, so you could imagine it might be sort of maybe an urban city, not quite LA because they're with over 20. This sort of ratio drops to 40. But then if you add more and more stations, so now you're in the LA case, you have like 20, 30, whatever stations, this ratio doesn't go any further. And in particular, the sort of drop here really seems to be caused by having at least some charging availability, but then the reliability piece, at least in this case, doesn't seem to directly influence this road trip gap. And so I want to kind of make 2 points about this. On the one hand, thinking about destinations as kind of the locality to put charging at. So I think when we're thinking about sort of ICEs, you think about where do I put the gas stations around the interstate corridors, and that's probably an important piece for the EV transition as well, right? Like you need to even be able to get to that destination. But then the second order question is, because charging takes longer than refueling, what can we do in sort of covering many more of those destinations with at least some availability? It might not be the super ultra fast charger, but at least making sure that you have some availability of charging there, because that seems to drop sort of this road trip gap by a third. And then, of course, there's kind of an open question that we're sort of continuing to explore. Why is there this gap of 39, 40%? And that could actually be your sort of baseline experience with reliability. Like, I don't want to use this result to say like reliability doesn't matter. It could be that you're sort of forming your expectation over time. Like, if I'm going to go somewhere, whether there's a charge or not, like there might be a chance it's not going to work out. But there might be other reasons as well of why there is this kind of difference. And so, of course, as the world is evolving, as there's like other vehicles coming out and charging infrastructure changes, would be really interesting if we get an opportunity to maybe to run this analysis in a different country with some updated data. But for now, I think both this drop, having some charging available, and then also even with really available infrastructure, it seems hard to push beyond the sort of 40% road trip gap. Yes, please. Yeah. Yeah. Well, so available and reliable to me is a distinction. So if you did it with your BMW in this case, you could just put it in your navigation system and then, okay, wonderful. And then you see those green dots pop up. So this would give you the availability, like you see where along the route is there a charging station. Now, I think one of the reasons that where you onto when it comes to reliability is like, what belief do I have about reliability? You might not go to this data that we're using from PlugShare. Like you might not go to the PlugShare website and just say like, hey, I know there's a charger there. I have some average belief of how well charging works in the United States, and you're good with that. If you wanted to figure out sort of the current best information about reliability in our world, you would go to PlugShare and see like, okay, this charger that I might consider charging at the destination if I look at all the comments, 90% of them seem to indicate this works fine, and then you get that update. But point well taken, like it could be that some of the reason why the reliability isn't giving us as much is because the individuals who are driving the cars have access to the availability from the navigation system, but don't have insight into the reliability score as well, especially in the long distance trip. Yeah.
How do you deal with the problem that I get to the charging station and there are 4 cars in front of me and they're going to take 20 minutes?
Yeah.
And I need to get to where I'm supposed to go in 2 hours from now.
Yeah. We don't here. is the short answer. Yeah, there's sort of the utilization question, right? I mean, in the vehicle, if the charging station is like modern enough, it might tell you like there might be sort of a green circle or a yellow circle or a red circle. But here we're not controlling for this. In principle, we could look at the data like, has the car stopped for, let's say, at that location for 20 minutes and then like moved by 5 meters or like not at all and then started charging. But yes, in here, we're not controlling for this. We're sort of assuming if there's a charger, you would have to incur the sort of extra long waiting time in that particular case. So I think it would sort of be probably part of the reason why you see this like 40% baseline of there's some chance there might be a charger, but I still have to wait and I don't want to take that risk. Yeah. 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 The main reason for us was there aren't that many stations with like one if you kind of look at the probability estimate. But I'm here interpreting your question as being of like, why don't we move the like 1 into the 2 and 9? We had originally set this up so that each of the cohorts here is approximately 1/3 of all destinations. So there's about 25, 26% of destinations. No, sorry, 17% of destinations have zero charging around them. And then 1 is like 6 or 7%. So basically, this chunk got to like almost 30%, and then this chunk is like 40% of destinations, and this chunk is the rest. So it's more to keep the sort of number of observations behind here the same. We had at some point in time also looked at forget about grouping this at all into like 0 to 1, 2 to 9. Just plot every number by itself. Like look at all the destinations with 0, all the ones with 1, 2, and 9. The drop off really seems to happen at 2. So that's why we included 0 and 1 into 1. But yeah, I can show you a graph with the full slope. But the original reason was to keep the number of observations comparable between the different units.
But your 3 bars there are only representing that slice as the 1 station.
What we do for the 0 stations is we take the reliability of the closest possible station to calculate a reliability score. Because if there's no station around, then like we're imputing the reliability score. But yeah, it does capture there could be no station there. And the idea was a bit that if you have to go to a station, well, if there's no station there and you wanted to do charging around it, you would have to find whatever closest possible station. And so that's why we figured that would be a reasonable imputation. But point well taken, we'll take the 0 and the 1 out, at least in some version. Cool. And so there's I don't want to get too much into this, but in the paper we also show that you sort of the matching helps to control a little bit for the adoption choice of like people get electric vehicles in areas where there aren't as many long trips, which seems to make sense. Like in Montana, there might be fewer EVs than somewhere here in the Northeast. So with that, I want to switch us over to the 99% of trips that aren't this like long distance trips. So we talked a lot about road distance, road trip gap, doing those long trips, but there's only 6 to 9 or so that you do a year. Most of the time when you use your vehicle, sort of from an OEM's perspective, how you interact with the vehicle is actually in this shorter everyday mobility. And so what I want to show you is a plot of how frequently are you repowering your vehicle. And I use repowering in a sense of if you're using an EV, you're going to recharge it. If you're using an ICE, you're going to refuel it. And so for you to sort of form your prior about what you're going to see, on the x-axis, we're going to plot remaining range when you stop the vehicle. So like you've driven somewhere and then let's say you get out of your car and there's 200 kilometers left. How likely are you to then recharge or refuel your vehicle? Okay, so you can think about how you think this plot's going to look like. The literature on electric vehicle and sort of range anxiety based on this 2015, 2018 survey data would kind of say here's where all the magic should happen. Basically, the experimental evidence is something like people have a range inventory or like a safety buffer that they're looking for. And so if you have less than about 50 miles, 100 kilometers, depending on which paper you believe, this is when electric vehicle users feel this sort of range anxiety, and here's where they would counteract by charging more. Okay? And then if you look at it in the empirical data, this is how it looks like. So the blue bar here again is ICE. The red line is ICE. This like very tiny thing here is our confidence interval because we have 300,000 of them, and they go on many different trips. And then the red one is electric vehicles. Electric vehicles that have an opportunity of doing home charging. And so the gray bar here, by the way, is the ratio of the two. So the higher the bar, relatively speaking, more the EVs are charging. And so no matter how much range you have left, electric vehicles are being charged more than ICEs. Like even at 300 kilometers remaining or 200, like the average user in this data set drives was like 50 or 60 kilometers a day. It's like you have many days of mobility remaining, still you're going to keep recharging it. And it doesn't seem to be that just the safety buffer is sort of a magic threshold. This just happens across the entire board. So you might think, clearly we finally found our range anxiety. We've done a lot of work. There we go. Almost, because what this data allows us to, we can kind of split out where is the charging happening. And what I'm going to split out is I'm going to split out home charging, which is you stop and charge within, this is rounded data, so at home, but within a kilometer from home, and anywhere else on the planet that is basically not within a kilometer of your home. And then this is how this looks like. And I know there's a lot of graphs and like fun shapes going on, so, but we can maybe start by focusing on the squares here. So the squares is both the ICE and the electric vehicle being far away from home and far here being not at home. And surprisingly, at least to us surprisingly, the red line here is below the blue line. So if you're not at home, EVs are actually being charged less often, conditional on some range at stopping, than ICEs. This is, if you will, the opposite of range anxiety. And the reason why we got this sort of aggregate dynamic from the first time is if you now condition it on being at home, now we're looking at the circles, this difference that we had before blows up even further. And it blows up for two reasons. Home charging is probably arguably very convenient. It takes like 30 seconds to refuel your vehicle. So you see this probability here skyrockets to almost 4 times as high as ICEs. And then likewise, most people, I know there's some like notable exceptions, but most people don't have a gas station right at home where they live. And so the refueling at home is going to be even lower than that. And so what I think this is kind of pointing to, at least for the vehicles with home charging, is it's less of a range anxiety story. If anything, it's sort of a positive story of this is a convenient technology for you to use. And from a sort of OEM perspective, how do you market this as like the last time you stopped at a gas station was before you bought this vehicle? So I'm not sure about the marketing pitch just quite yet, but thinking about this implication for how do we communicate the technology to users, I think is really interesting. Yes.
I want to come back to the time differential for the two different vehicle types.
Mm-hmm.
We were talking about the long distance travel, 20 minutes versus 5 minutes. Thinking about total time to destination.
Yeah.
I think that's important. It becomes even more important here because if I'm at home, as you point out, time to fuel is 0.
Yep.
But if I'm away from home, time to fuel is actually significant. So I think if you incorporate that in, I think explains a lot of what's going on.
So on this part, I get you. Like if I'm at home, there's basically no binding like it takes me 30 seconds and I don't have to wait for the charge to complete. How is the like extra long charging if I'm remote impacting me? Is that what you're saying? This is like it's going to take me longer, therefore I'm not going to bother go to the gas station. I'm just going to
The long distance one, I think it has a lot to do with people's decisions about whether they want to buy this.
Yes, the sort of added time to their road trip. Yeah, no, but I think a positive version of this is, so you could pitch, I think, the negative idea of like it on a long distance trip, it's going to take you a lot of time, so therefore you're going to wait until you're home. You could also say like you don't have to bother ever going to the gas station for 99% of your trips, because there will always be this disconvenience. Sorry, I'm pointed to the wrong line. This convenient option of like it's going to take me very very limited time. But yeah, point well taken there. The time to charge will matter and drive some of the choices. Yes. Yeah. Okay, question. I'm doing this like not as accurately as I should be. Question is like, how do I define the remaining charge? Every once in a while I remember. Yeah, we have this from the dashboard. So the whatever the vehicle is going to tell the driver, this is the remaining range. And so we observe what vehicle are we dealing with, and then what's the state of charge. Yes. It's part of the sort of telemetry data package we're getting. Yeah. Yes, please. So, sorry, repeat the first part of the.
Like if you have data, like in the far from home data, if you have like data that like people charge from their work or their like schools where they like can charge very routinely without any like timing constraints, like doesn't it kind of inflate the far from home data in a way?
Yeah, I think that would even go for our. So the question is like, do we have data of possibly other locations that, if I'm understanding the question correctly, other locations that someone with an EV might visit frequently to charge at, for example, work charging, where their car is parked anyways for a longer period of time, and whether that would inflate our data. That could be, although if that were the case and we take sort of home charging out of it, I think that would even help our story further. So if I'm taking work charging, if I'm taking work charging out of this line and the true probability is even lower, I think that would even more strongly make the argument for why electric vehicles are being charged as frequently when on the road. In the data, about 10% of charging is what we think is work charging. And I say think where it's work charging. For home, we have a specific indicator in the data, sort of the underlying ground truth, if you will. Work charging, we need to sort of impute based on commuting patterns and how frequently is a person, like say Monday through Friday, charging at a certain destination. But yeah, about 10% of the data is that. Yeah. Why not include work charging in the home charging category? Well, mainly because of us needing to do some imputation for it and having a really clean measure of like home charging. And I think conceptually, because the actor who can enact some of this is also different. Like if the OEM wanted to sell charging or like an EV to an individual, they could themselves sell the whole package of like, here's home charging, here's the vehicle, and you can go do it. Versus if you think about work charging, you would need to convince your employer to doing that. So I think it's like it directionally goes in the same direction goes in the same direction of like reducing the time you need to wait for your vehicle to stop charging, but who is taking an action of installing is different. But to the people who want to do a lot of work charging, that might be the people who don't have home charging. And for those of you who thought there aren't enough lines on this graph, we can add more to it. So this is yellow, there isn't that much to interpret here, so forgive the slightly convoluted display, but yellow is basically the same analysis as before, but those are the EVs in our data set that don't have home charging. And so those would be the kind of vehicles that charge anywhere, including at work. And there you see, like, no matter whether they're at home or at work, their sort of charging propensity follows the ICE out in the wild, let's call it. Cool. With that, couple of things. We have a BEV usage. I think the sort of one of the takeaways I want to convey is in a fast-moving field where technology is evolving every few years and there's new generations of vehicles coming out. If you control for at least one subset of OEMs, we're in a world now where electric vehicles are being driven as far throughout the year as ICEs. There's still this whole road trip gap. So yes, for long trips, it does seem like ICEs are still sort of having a little bit of an advantage. But if you want to know how big of an advantage, the gap seems to be 3 trips per year, and you can shrink it by providing charging at the destination. And then there's still sort of some underlying difference that seems to be hard to get rid of. So I think more work remains to be done of like beyond infrastructure, from a reliability, from a consumer education perspective. How do I remove this? And I'm not saying 3 as a number is like cause for celebration and will everyone convince everyone to hop on an EV. So knowing it is good, but what to do with it we'll have to figure out, especially for those drivers who want to make sure that every trip throughout the year can be fully done without any charging concerns. And then last but not least, at least from a charging perspective, the range anxiety story, if you have home charging, doesn't seem to play out. If anything, it seems to be that with home charging, you're sort of in a more convenient landscape of, I don't have to wait for my charger, I can easily plug in at home. And when I'm out driving my car for 98.8% of trips that are short, I'm in a good spot. That was the mobility side of the equation. Yes, please.
Question. Can you control for multi-car ownership so that if the family has
Yeah.
I don't even know how that would change this, but
I have a slide in the appendix, but I don't want to skip like 30 slides back. So it's a little tricky to control for it because we only see one OEM, right? So we couldn't control like on average because we're not we don't know anything about the household beyond them having a car. But because we have the user ID and the vehicle ID, we do see some users who have access to 2 vehicles and who drive them. So one of the things we did was looking at like for those users that can sort of switch between vehicles, how are they using them? In particular, one of the things we looked at, are they using their EV different on weekdays versus weekends? We're kind of thinking like maybe one is the vehicle that you commute with, and the other one is like joy road trip on a weekend. And we didn't see any difference. Like it's very noisy data. We have like several hundred of those users, so not as many. But on average, like there's no difference in the say percentage of miles you're driving on the weekday versus the weekend with the EV, which sort of I think in our mind somewhat corroborates this idea of like once you have an EV, you use it in fairly similar ways. But that's not like there's many vehicles that exist that users have access to that we don't see.
For BMW, are the EVs and the ICEs roughly equivalent in other characteristics that matter? I mean, I think of like we have a 3-row SUV because we have a couple kids and they have friends.
Yes.
We've also been talking about getting a small EV for like local trips, and I can imagine that for a long trip we'd use the SUV. Yeah. And for like carpool to soccer practice, we'd use the SUV. So it'd be there'd be some small trips. So I'm just wondering.
No.
Looking at this, do you have roughly similar types of vehicles in both types?
Yeah, no. So, and I should have been maybe even more explicit. So initially when I showed you, it was just conditional means across all models. In the paper, what we also do is we like control for model fixed effects. We'd get at some of this. In the matching, it is actually model specific. And what we do is we look at like sedans and then SUVs. And in the data, we have like three electric vehicles, which is basically like one large SUV and then 2 different types of sedans. Actually 3 different types of sedans, sorry. So it's 4 vehicles total. And they are at least from the feature characteristics other than like seats and so on, size similar, and they're priced within sort of $5,000 to $7,000. And then of course there's some subsidies and so on that wouldn't, but they're approximately the same. And yeah, when we control for it, it doesn't seem to change our results. Okay, so on a mobility side, are we there yet? I was told that if you have to ask the question, you already know the answer. Maybe, but I think we're making reasonably good progress. And I want to again emphasize this idea of like this is eternally changing. So even as someone who's looking at this kind of data almost daily, you're kind of surprised to see even in the United States the electric vehicle charging build out. The vehicle data that we have access to has again average range of 280. The next generation of vehicles that they're releasing has 400. So I think all of those kind of dynamics are pointing in an interesting direction for EVs, even in the United States. Of course, in other countries with more charging infrastructure, different prices, things are even more different. And so I want to give you a little sneak peek on the managed charging side of things, which I thought is hopefully interesting to you from a policy perspective. The results that we get to, and it's one of the things that I'm just passionate about, is like a managing of intermittency, and it relates exactly to the same kind of data set. So I think it's interesting to think about how you now with this new technology as a firm have different decisions to make and kind of need to adjust. Same as a regulator, in this case as a utility, how as your customer, your residential customer is making their own kind of choices of getting EVs, how you have to start responding with your, for example, tariff and rate structure. So that's what I briefly wanted to touch upon, and then I'll try to end it at the hour so we have more time for questions if necessary. So it's the second part of the conversation. But we get here basically from exactly the same data as before. So this is like a vehicle that is driving around. As before, we've seen the different drives that they take. So one, let's say, stops at 5 p.m. And per the earlier question, we know exactly at what kind of charge the vehicle stops when it stops. So let's say 65% of battery charge. And then we see that the car starts driving again at 8 a.m., but now is fully charged. And so because we see this kind of data for the 21,000 electric vehicles in the... Is this me? I'm hearing some like sound. Okay, running water. Good. I was like, is this in my head? Okay, 21,000 battery electric vehicles. And because we see this kind of behavior across all those drives, we get to about 1.5 million charging events. And so what an event would tell you is like you would see, okay, we're going from 65 to 100% because I know which vehicle you have. I can tell you how much energy did you need to charge. And because we know the location, we can even infer the charging speed. I'm going to spare us a conversation on like how do you exactly calculate the charging speed, but I'm happy to talk offline. For home, we're being conservative at 7 kilowatts, and then if you're remote, like if you're out in the world, we take the highest charge that we've seen you charge at a certain location. And so with this, for example, in this case, you come home at 5 p.m. and you needed to charge 28 kilowatt hours at a speed of 7 kilowatts. I know the units are a little confusing, but if you divide it out, it leaves you with 4 hours that you would have needed to charge. So you're coming home at 5, you're leaving again at 8. Somewhere in those hours overnight, you need to put 4 hours of charging in. And now we get to the question of like, what does managed charging mean? But what we're to get to the what does managed charging mean, the data we're using for it is 35 utilities in the United States. It's actually 38 utilities, but Florida and Georgia Power don't have wholesale market rates that we have access to. So we're basically looking at all the vehicles in the large population areas in the United States. And for each of them, we're going to calculate the wholesale market rate and residential rate. If there's a EV residential rate, we're going to use the EV rate. If there's a time of use rate, we're going to use that. And if there's neither an EV rate nor a time of use rate, we're going to use the flat rate that the residents have access to. And the idea here is you're kind of getting both sides of the coin. You're getting the like, what would the utility care about to like keep generation cost low? And then what would you as an individual do if you just care about optimizing your electricity bill? And so if you take those 1.5 million charging events that we have access to, about 2/3 of them happen in those areas where we have full data to. So I'm going to, all the things I'm going to talk about is for those about 1 million charging events in those areas where we see the wholesale market price and the residential price for it. So managed charging. There's many different ways with which you can make money if you try to do managed charging. I'm going to focus us on two. One is V1G, and the acronyms, I'm going to reuse the acronyms. So I'm going to introduce them a little bit. V1G is basically throttling the charge. So one thing and I'll show you a picture in a second of how it looks like. What you could do is you could just the vehicle charges, you charge as rapidly as possible. That would be unmanaged. The V1G idea is like, I know that you're coming home at 5. I know that you always leave the next morning at 8 or 9. What is the best time of day to charge, given that I know the prices that we're going to face? And then there's the, I think, pretty interesting piece of demand response, which is in particular moments of high stress on the grid, how much load can you reduce to either help the grid or reduce prices? And we'll get to it. So one is the V1G is like, you can do this every day just to like respond your charging speed to whatever the prices are. The demand response is sometimes in the year when the grid is under high stress, how much can an EV fleet or an individual EV respond? And I think that's getting in particular important now that we're trying to build data centers and a lot of other things that put high stress on the grid. So in those moments, can, for example, electric vehicles respond? So not everyone is trying to consume power at the same time. So that's how the demand response is relevant. Now, there's some fun mathematical characterizations that you can write down, but we're going to skip that. I'm going to do proof by picture. So here's the car that arrives with like 75% charge and 100% leaves with 100% charge as before, but I've sort of overimposed the wholesale market price. And it follows this sort of duck curve picture that we've seen before. It's sort of high in the morning, then drops throughout the day, and then the car comes home. Unfortunately, the car was at work when the prices were so low, so you're plugging in right before this sort of spike for the evening. If you didn't optimize this charging at all, this is the picture you would be left with. You just come home, you charge for 4 hours, and you're done. So you would charge throughout this entire evening peak. If you were to fully optimize this with on the wholesale market price, you would kind of charge a little bit when there's still solar power available, charge at night, and then charge again the next morning. So the car is ready to go at 8 a.m. when you're leaving. So that's kind of the V1G managed charging idea. Does it make sense? Okay. Yes. So if you, for example, on day-ahead market prices, you could lock them in. But on real-time market prices, of course, there would be some uncertainty. Yes. And by the way, you can in the app like of using a BMW, you can tell people, okay, I'm going to leave tomorrow at like 7. I mean, you can set up fixed schedules, and you can in particular tell people, no, I actually need it. Like people can tell your app, I need charge now because I'm going to leave as soon as possible. So there's some amount of foresight built in here. Now, the wholesale market price, this is sort of blue line. You as an individual, though, you're typically not facing the wholesale market price, you're facing your own residential tariff. And in this example, it might be a tariff that at 4 p.m. Has sort of the peak for the time of use tariff. And so if you're on such kind of a tariff, you would wait until 9 p.m. when the tariff drops lower, and then you would start charging. And then, importantly, the timings here are somewhat misaligned. And so one of the things we wanted to do with this work is this misalignment has been somewhat understood in other cases in the literature, but sort of an open question with electric vehicles is, because you have so much electricity load and you have so much flexibility, how is the actual behavior of the fleet that we're seeing and the timing when people come home and plug in, how is it actually playing out under the current price structure that we've set? And so if you're the EV owner, let's start with you getting an EV and trying to use this charging optimization to save money. This is going to be on the x-axis. So this is for the different markets. Every bubble here is a certain utility region. The size of the bubble is how many charging events we've seen. And I've sort of written the acronyms for the different utilities, mostly in California, where we've seen the most events. And the x-axis is how much saving can you do. So in reality, just by kind of throttling the charge relative to what's best for time of use, you can save somewhere between 80 to, like in San Diego, $300 a year. And again, if you're kind of thinking about electric vehicles being a little bit more expensive upfront but cheaper to use, any kind of additional usage saving you can get might be interesting to get that balance towards people adopting EVs. But the interesting story here, I think, is less the 80 to 300. It is actually the fact that they're all under the zero line. And the y-axis here is the savings of the generation on the generation side. And if the savings are negative, that means we're increasing our generation cost. And so basically, the $80 savings here for PG&E, in PG&E, if all the EVs that we're seeing were to respond just to their own time of use price, on average, it would increase the generation cost by 20. Mainly because the cutoff is at 9 p.m. and then you start charging at 9 p.m. If that happens to be a day where at 9 p.m. electricity prices are still high, then you're going to incur those costs. And so it's one of those things, I think, where those rates were initially designed for you as households being somewhat able to respond and shift your demand a little bit, but they're not calibrated for, I can strategically wait and then at once shift like 7 kilowatts of charge to a particular point in time.
Is there a question, when we look at PG&E, that's a big circle.
Yep.
Is there a question that by doing this, we're creating this kind of clustering right at that point in night when the price comes down and everyone's coming online at that same time, and they're like just enough people now in Northern California with EVs that actually matters for the grid? How should we think about this that as we're going to bring more and more electrification into transport, that we're going to need to think about how we sort of spread over the course of the night?
Yeah, I think two things. It's like the time of use tariff that you have. If you think about managed charging, it's probably not going to be a 0-1 switch. It's not going to be like everyone at 9 p.m. like switch on the EVs and then have this massive load spike. I know in California they're trying to do sort of like direct load management on that level where you say that, hey, I have an EV, and then they're sort of spread out all the EV charging. So it's, I know some start at 9, others at 9:15, 9:20, and you sort of randomize it out. I actually think there's a secondary problem that we're not talking about at all here. It's at the distribution level. If you're in a neighborhood with like 5 or 6 different EVs, you get exactly the same dynamic even earlier because you're all overloading the transformer. So I think the response is, in either case, you need to do something different about the EV load, which is what I'm going to tell you in like one slide. I think those need to fundamentally be managed differently than household loads, just because there's so much flexibility in them.
So it's more than just sending out a price and setting out a price schedule and saying set up on your phone, your app, when you're going to charge.
I think it needs to be more sophisticated than that. Otherwise, you have those very concrete peaks. But one of the ways in which I think you could do it is you could either do it as a utility directly, or in this case, I think the OEM might be interested in this. Like if I myself have control over several thousand, tens of thousands of vehicles in your service area, I can communicate with you like what's the best aggregation and what kind of curve would you like for charging? Because I can do this sort of, I see what vehicle needs how much energy and I can do this sort of smoothing. But yeah, that's an issue. Yes.
If I understand what you're trying to convey here, you're essentially talking about misalignment between the TOU time and wholesale time. Right?
Correct.
Either below the 0 bar or above.
Yes.
Right?
I think it might almost be in the headline on the next slide. You got it exactly right. Misalignment between time of use. Yeah.
But the point is that that problem should be somewhat viewed independently from from the EV, it is a design of the rate,
Yes.
design of the pricing.
Yes.
EV is a good kind of a gaming of the system, if you wish.
Yes.
Right?
Well, I'm not sure if I would agree that they need to be designed independently. I think.
Or, you know, this problem is even before EV comes in, and now EV is exacerbating.
Exactly. So I think the problem always existed that you need to design a rate, a time of use rate, where you have sort of two levers of, let's say, I have a low rate and a high rate. And this was always an imperfect exercise of trying to match onto like a very volatile wholesale market. But I think if you're dealing with household load, there's only so much like adjustment I can do. I can switch my laundry to later, and I can maybe like leave the lights on a little bit or move the AC. But now with an electric vehicle, any kind of mismatch that exists can be exploited at like 7 kilowatts or something, which is like several times higher than a normal household load would be. But yes, it's the exact. That's precisely where we're going. And so if you do this on the flip side, you could say like, how about all the EVs need to charge exactly to what would be best from a grid perspective? Best in the sense of we have the lowest generation cost on average. If you do this as an EV, you still have to pay your residential rate. So suddenly your savings don't look that hot anymore. It's sort of like $0. In the case of PG&E, on average, it's only $10. The good thing for the grid is this would actually lower your generation cost. And so now if you're thinking about sort of a policy tool, if the EV owner does whatever they want and save $80, and if you want to convince them to do whatever you would like them to do as a system operator, and they only save 10, how do I transfer those $70 over? In particular, because you're yourself only saving this sort of difference of 50. And so that's why in a second, we're calling it, we call it transfer payment. The misalignment has gone from the site. But yes, we're calling this sort of misalignment between how much of a transfer payment would you need and how much generation cost you could actually save as a utility. And currently, with the current rate structure, this kind of transfer isn't possible yet. And so I think a question then becomes, how do I either realign it, or in my opinion, is there maybe an opportunity to get the electric vehicles or any kind of those large loads onto separate tariffs, where I think one of the reasons why, for example, having households on exact loads that follow the wholesale market price is unpopular because you get hit by all those spikes if the market prices are high. Well, that's true for household loads that you can't adjust, but maybe for an electric vehicle, there might be more willingness to make prices dynamic because the electric vehicle can adjust. But yes, Elaine.
Christian, on your previous slide, are these savings versus non-optimized charging or versus gasoline?
Savings versus non-optimized charging, yes. I can try to get you to versus gasoline, but I don't have that.
No, I just wanted to understand the magnitude.
No, yeah.
Maybe I'm getting ahead of you, but how does what are kind of major thoughts on whether it's not just optimizing on timing, but there's V2G, so there's opportunities for selling back there with the ducks.
Yes.
That kind of stuff.
Yeah, this is we had V2G here as part of the managed charging. Then we wrote up the manuscript, and then we were like, this starts getting very intricate and very complicated. I can tell you the reason why I'm currently not talking about V2G, and it's mainly that if you wanted to do V2G, so the idea is like, well, how does V2G factor into this decision making, which would be vehicle to grid. So you're taking the battery and you're selling back to the grid. In order to do this, you need a different kind of charger. And the charger is, depending a bit who you ask, but on the order of several $1,000s more expensive than a normal one. And the short answer is this is currently only profitable in Texas. And in no other market would it even be remotely interesting financially. So that's why we took that part out of the paper. But it would, in my mind, this would be sort of an extra step on this layer of different managed charging things you could do. So let me just wrap up with this one and then open it up for questions. Exactly to Liz's earlier point, there's this fundamental mismatch. I have to have a rate that I can communicate, and it needs to be somewhat simple and adherable to. But now I have a technology that can very rapidly change its load and respond to any kind of price it sees. And this mismatch that always existed is now being exacerbated. And if you just take the current time of use rate and the wholesale market rate, this doesn't allow the utility or give the utility enough savings where I could, let's say, pay the electric vehicle to start charging in a way that is beneficial to the grid. But that's precisely what currently is being done in a lot of pilots where I'm going to pay you, let's say, $100, $150 a year so you can do this kind of load following. Of course, if you're losing money with every vehicle in your pilot because it's not profitable, that might be one of the reasons why those pilots currently aren't being scaled as much. And so with an eye on time, I'm going to leave it here. There would be many fun things to talk about in demand response, but we'll get there. Where's the final slide? Too many slides. There we go. Woo! I should have a fast forward button. I think we made it to the first piece. V1G, currently it can save electric vehicles hundreds of dollars. So if you're an OEM, you probably want to offer this as soon as you can and figure out whatever kind of sharing we have to do here with the utility. I think one of the things they're trying to do is sort of create consortia where you have multiple OEMs set up the kind of infrastructure and information sharing with the one utility. But from a system level perspective, if you just do it on current rate structure, it doesn't work out. And so the question is, do we either redesign the rates for everyone? Do you design them for EVs? Or is there a chance to take out the large electrified loads entirely and give them separate rates? And with that, thank you very much for listening.
You, Kaps. We have about 5 minutes for questions. Given the time, I want to see if there's anyone in the audience who wants to jump in with the first question. Yes, please.
Do you have a sense for how future design of electrical grids could work in terms of not overloading transformers for residential areas, or?
Do I have an idea of how the distribution grid should be redesigned? Yeah. I don't have really good answers for that. I think one of the questions is like, how do you even get the information out of the system? And I think that's sort of currently an open challenge. Yeah, I've never looked into this mainly from a data limitation perspective, because I think a lot of that distribution level data is only available to utilities. I know of some companies we can chat offline that are actively like looking into this, but I haven't done it as a research level question. Although I think in general for EVs and any kind of those electrified loads, before you're hitting those wholesale market caps, this might be actually the first bottleneck in especially neighborhoods that are very inclined to adopt those technologies. Yeah.
It'd be interesting to get some order of magnitude type things, like how much are we looking at in terms of potential grid savings? If we think about the denominator being the total bills that the consumer is paying or something like that, or some measures of overall important. How big a deal is this? And so and then a related question is, there's lurking behind some of your proposals, there's a fair amount of whatever we might think of as, for lack of a better word, infrastructure investment that's necessary.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking in particular of like the communications that are, even to do V1G, you're going to need to have some communication about these rates going over the power lines and going through meters. And I suspect that the meter at my house and probably most people's houses won't allow that communication through the meter.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of meters that would need to be replaced, et cetera, et cetera. And that adds up and isn't fast. So have you thought about those sorts of cost benefit considerations?
Yeah, on a cost benefit, for example, I think it becomes very clear for the demand response piece. Like I didn't show the slide, but for 1,000 EVs in this data, you can do demand reduction by like 300 kilowatts. And the 300 kilowatts, depending on the market, might be like $20,000 or something of savings to 100,000, depending on the market you're in. So for 1,000 EVs that can follow the load in those critical events, it's somewhere between $20,000 and $100,000 a year in savings. And then how you allocate them, I've thought about, but have not come up with a solution. To the other sort of infrastructure question of like, how do you make sure that all of this works? I think one thing is definitely smart meters, and you probably want this at a residential level for multiple areas, including like heat pumps and other things. One way that the OEMs are exploring, like two ways they're exploring it. One is, again, with those consortia where you just get more standardization together and then basically come with a ready, like a protocol and all those kind of ideas that the utilities can implement. The other thing is using the car itself, because the car already has sort of smart sensing capabilities, connected to the internet, it can exchange ideas, and it can do a lot of that throttling. But even that, I don't understand the engineering. There might be other experts in the room who can tell you more about this. Yeah.
Okay, let's go to one of those experts.
Actually, yeah, on the very point, I think perhaps, Jim, one way to think about that is you don't necessarily have to retrofit the existing smart meter anymore, but the charger themselves will have that communication data receiving capability. So that could probably save a bit of a trouble there. But on the very same line of thoughts on infrastructure, you mentioned about adding some more charging would reduce the gap between ICE and EV by as much as 29%, right? So I'm sort of curious, just from your first order estimation perspective, let's say a city of Cambridge, how much more a charging infrastructure do we need to add to kind of get the most bang for the buck for closing the gap between ICE and EVs?
Interesting. Yeah. In Cambridge, zero. But the idea is that I think Cambridge already has smart charging. Like it's sort of a destination question. It's less, I think, the density in the sense of like how many chargers does the city of Cambridge need? Like I've looked at the map like 2 weeks ago with like there's, I don't know, 50 new chargers that are being developed. There's like 30 already existing. With that in my mind, if a vehicle were to come to Cambridge and wanted to charge here, like they could find a charging spot to do so. So from our sort of ranging road trip gap analysis, that would be fine. I think the question is, how many destinations like this exist? How many destinations in the US exist where you drive to, and then within this radius, so let's say 5 kilometers, 10 kilometers, or whatever threshold you want to use, there's just no charging. And so I think what I was trying to advocate for this is not the how do we optimize the charging utilization in Cambridge, but how many locations exist. And I don't have a back of the envelope answer for it, but I will calculate it. How many of those, like, let's say rural remote areas exist where there's zero charging right now, and you would prefer there to be one? And then you just sort of have a, I don't know, a more dense network of there's at least something to get you home or to connect to, and then you can have fast charging on the interstate or something else.
Let's go to David for the last question.
Thank you. This is great. If I'm not wrong, this is somewhat about who is capturing the value of the batteries and timing, et cetera. And I'm wondering if you see any difference in investor-owned utility territories versus municipal cooperatives, et cetera, where in general, what you would think of the profits are plowed back into infrastructure, et cetera, that might have less misalignment. Obviously, some of the misalignment, I think, is about stickiness, difficulty of changing rates and tariffs and all that. But some of it may have to do with the overarching value capture that's in these different systems.
Yeah.
Any thoughts on that?
I haven't looked at it for this particular day. So we have like a separate project on like data centers now. Like, what's the effect of data centers doing on prices, and how does this interact with the investor-owned utility? My sense would be overall that if you have any kind of incentive of responding to this cost, like the cost increase, you would be better off, or like you're faster to move towards that electrified smart managed charging. I think one of the things I'm worried about is I purposefully chose generation cost as the metric. For the utility, this might actually be perfectly fine to have a generation cost. If you can just add another gas plant into your rate base, you might actually be happy about it. So yes, I've thought about it. My sense would be, yeah, the investor-owned utilities could be really, really interesting if they're able to capitalize on more than sort of generation cost. But I think in general, for this data, I can't give you any like results on how they differ.
So before we wrap up, let me note that we will skip next Monday in the seminar series. Happy Patriots Day. We'll reconvene in 2 weeks for our last seminar of the semester. We're pleased we'll be hosting. Oh, that's going to be canceled too? Okay. We'll send an update about that, about our schedule. So I won't say the rest of what I was going to say, based on the information from Lucier. That's very fresh, hot off the press. So let me just jump to the last point of today's seminar. Please join me in thanking Professor Kaps for a fantastic talk today. Thanks, Kaps. That was great.
Thanks for having me. Yeah, no.